Welcome back to our chapter on motivation. Today we're going to pick up where we left off and talk about sex and sexuality, which are part of the primary motives or primary drives discussed in the earlier video. Now, talking about sex, we actually need to talk about the brain. Despite our fact that we typically think of the body's erogenous zones, we think of our genitalia as those parts and pieces that are responsible for sexual stimulation. It's once again the brain's job to do so. Our brain must experience those symbols, those signs, those experiences, and do something with them. Interpret that data as sexually arousing. If you've ever had someone hit on you that you found strange or creepy, then you understand this. Your brain is making that call, not your body. Now, we do develop sexual scripts over time, and that brings us to the big piece of behavior, because your sexual script is unique to you, though it's been built from parts and pieces of those around you. Basically everything from when is it appropriate to have sex to what's the right kind of sex, from holding hands in public to no sex before marriage. Whatever you've decided about sex and the sexual process, you've been building that from what people taught you, what your peers told you, things you've watched, things you've read, things you've experienced yourself. And so our behaviors are somewhat unique, though they do sort of fall into similar patterns that we'll look at today. Now, as far as the brain, much like we talked about hunger, there are parts of the brain responsible for sexual arousal. The hypothalamus, which was always already linked to hunger, is also responsible for giving us those cues to flip those switches, if you will, to determine sexual attraction. We also find that our temporal lobe and the sides of this brain also show activity when we talk about sexual arousal. When you think about the process of having sex, the orgasm, sort of that neuromuscular release, that climax that most of us pursue in a sexual activity, will actually, at a neurological level, is about a rush of dopamine, that neurotransmitter that's linked in part to emotional changes. Also, that relaxed period, that sort of content period shortly after orgasms, well, we see an increase of oxytocin, that hormone that we mentioned before, the neurotransmitter rather, that is linked to things like love and connection and affection, those sort of operations. Now, in studying how sex works, specifically the biology of sex, it may seem like something that we all take for granted, but realize for most of medical history and certainly scientific history, studying sex was off limits. It was considered taboo, certainly here in our culture in the U.S. William Masters and Virginia Johnson, out of the 50s, were actually those who sort of bucked against the trend and decided that they would actually study the process of having sex as if it was another biological function to figure out exactly how it works. Are there differences? Are there similarities? And not surprisingly to us today, they found that men and women experience sex quite differently. Yes, we have excitement phases. We do sort of hit a sexual plateau. And we even experience orgasms, but it's at that point that the biology differs. For example, women can have multiple orgasms and return and fall to that plateau level, whereas for men enter a refractory period after the first orgasm, which makes it impossible to have an orgasm until a certain period of time has passed. Again, we weren't able to study the body or the biology of sex for the longest time, and even today's world is still considered fairly taboo. It's sort of difficult to research these topics because of the sensitivity we have in this culture of sort of sex and sexuality. Now, in terms of sex, it's not just biology that plays a part. Yes, your brain has to have those switches flip, but the question might be, well, what did you learn from your culture, from your environment, about when to flip those switches? For example, your book goes into these two cultures, and I encourage you to read about one very conservative and one very liberal across the sexual spectrum. And those are political terms. I'm using philosophical language here. The U.S. is basically in the middle of sexual continue. Whatever you think of in terms of how sex or sexual is this country, is this nation, are the people of America, realize that in terms of our perspectives, our identities, our practices, we're actually somewhat in the middle, which is fairly common in that distribution. There are always examples around this planet of places far more conservative or far more liberal with sex and sexuality. Now, in talking about sex, it's important for us to talk about the concept of teaching sex. We mentioned this very briefly when we talked about adolescent problems in our developmental chapter. Well, it's worth revisiting this concept that we're always trying to figure out the right amount of information to educate ourselves on about sex. We do know that in sex education programs, regardless of their angle, which we'll get to in a second, generally there's two main goals. To encourage young people to delay sexual activity until they're physically or psychologically mature enough to handle those responsibilities, and or try to reduce teen pregnancy and sexually transmitted infections for those who are practicing sex. Now, in this country, in the U.S., as we've mentioned before, there is great disagreement about who should talk about sex, who should teach it, when should you talk about it, what parts do you include in the program, do you teach only these parts or only these parts? And so when we look at other countries who are doing it quite differently, where they have one unified sexual education theme, one unified curriculum that all schools must abide by, here in the U.S., we're still struggling with exactly what to communicate. Right now, there's basically two broad sexual ed programs vying for attention. There's the abstinence-only approach, which tends to focus on, well, as the name implies, not having sex at all until marriage. And typically it does that by emphasizing that sex before marriage can and is harmful. It typically focuses on contraceptives only in terms of failure rates. And it even focuses on the negative, the scary, the fearful aspects of sex and sexuality, though there has been criticism leveled against abstinence-only approach in providing misleading information, such as certain types of birth controls causing certain types of biological and neurological problems, which is simply untrue, or misleading with the failure rates of certain birth controls. But again, the topic is sex is bad. Sex is harmful, especially if done before marriage. This is different than the comprehensive approach, which, while it does teach abstinence, it also teaches other parts of sex and sexuality. It talks about different types of sexual behavior. It talks about different types of birth control, their effectiveness, their failure rates, and the different varieties there. It does offer information for those who are sexually active on how to be safer in terms of pregnancy and STI, and yes, it does encourage delays when possible. So it's a more robust, complete program, but right now, as we mentioned before, we still sort of struggle about ways to teach, in part because we have the prevailing myth in our culture, and I'm telling you now, it is a myth. We have the data that by talking about sex or teaching about sex, we will somehow increase the rate of adolescent sex or sexual practices. That's simply untrue. Regardless, talking about something does not suddenly increase the amount of it. The same myth came with suicide we talked about in a previous chapter. Now, in terms of talking about sex, we can compare these two sex ed programs to see if there's one that's better or not. For abstinence-only programs, when we compare those to schools with nothing, use those as a control group, we do find that there is typically no noticeable delays in sexual behaviors, despite what the moral or the messages of the program is. We also find that in schools with abstinence-only programs typically have a higher incidence of teen pregnancy than those in comprehensive. In fact, comprehensive sex ed programs is by and far superior to preventing or reducing teen pregnancy and STI transmission. We do not see an increase in sexual behavior, as I said before. That is a myth. Those adolescents who wish to be sexually active will find a way to be sexually active. The question is, do we want to equip them with the information and education to do it as safe as possible? Now, while talking about sex and adolescence and sex ed, I want to revisit the topic of pregnancy. I don't want to go over this again because, again, we did cover it in Chapter 9. I just want to make reference to the idea that it is still decreasing. We are still getting better at this. However, we still have one of the highest rates. So we're sort of in this this good and bad notion that, yes, our teen pregnancy is way too high, especially compared to other industrial countries. But it has been steadily reducing itself. In terms of our education levels, our practicing safe sex, our being more abstinent. And as I said, the data seems to indicate that the more robust comprehensive sexual programs tend to produce the best results for us. All right, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about sexual behavior and sexual orientation. Now, I mentioned earlier that in studying how sex works, it's actually been a very difficult process because in the medical world, as Bailey, the cultural world, we don't know how to talk about sex. It's considered taboo, immoral in some circles, forbidden, an adult practice best left in the bedroom. But realize human beings have been having sex since the dawn of our species. And that brings us to the topic of if we are going to eventually study or scientifically examine sex and sexuality, we have to first define our terms, as in, what do you mean by sex? It's pretty easy to say, oh, sex, that's when you have intercourse, or that's when you procreate to make babies. That's obviously the sort of biological end game of sex, is to reproduce our species. But what about gay men and women? What about oral sex? What about masturbation? Those seem like sexual acts, however, they don't cause reproduction. They do not cause offspring to come. So are they still sex? Well, for the purposes of our discussion, we're going to say yes. Anything that produces a sexual arousal and ultimately orgasmic response, we can lump into these sexual behaviors. Now, in this chapter, we're not going to focus on sexual deviancies such as paraphilias, but we might revisit those when we look at our mental health chapter. Now, I mentioned Masters and Johnson. I also want to talk about Alfred Kinsey, another individual who in the 1940s, similar to Masters and Johnson, disagreed with the notion that sex has to be something that is taboo, at least in the realm of scientific inquiry. Kinsey was actually an entomologist studying insects, had his PhD in that area, but because of his own experiences in his childhood and his current relationship, became fascinated in the psychology of sex and sexuality. He eventually interviewed many people and published the Kinsey Reports in 1948, the first real study of American sexual behavior that had ever been done. Now, looking back, we find that his information is not very good, and that's because he lacked representative samples. At this period of sort of closeted sexual discussion, not surprisingly, the only men and women he found who were open to frankly discussing their sexual behaviors were those who didn't necessarily meet the norm. In more recent years, from the 90s and even just a few years ago, we're constantly seeing much larger, much more accurate pictures of sex and sexuality. We're discovering that old beliefs are simply not true. For example, in Kinsey's early studies, it looked as if most men and women cheated on their partner. Well, again, an unrepresentative sample skewed that data, whereas today we know that the majority of men and women are faithful to their partners that they're in a sexual relationship with. There also was the notion that it was the single individuals that had a lot more sexual activity, that were a lot more sexually active. We know that today is untrue. Married couples or long-term partners have far more sex than singles, and it kind of makes sense. If you're already in a pre-existing sexual relationship, you're more likely to have sex, and actually much more likely to do it well based on communication, practice as part of that relationship. Now, sexuality is how we express our sexual interests, and we'll kind of get to the topic of sexual orientation in a second. But for now, I want to focus on this sort of basic assumption of heterosexuality. Males and females experience sex together, because often we're told that men and women think about, act about, experience sex in different ways. That's somewhat true and somewhat false. Yes, we've seen biologically, as Masters and Johnson showed us, that our bodies do create and produce different sexual responses based on the sex of being male or female. You can use the word gender if that makes it easier to keep those terms in your head. To give you an example, though, of the psychology of sex or sexuality between men and women, I'm going to show you a pretty famous study. It's also a little bit comical, but it sort of shows you how not only is biology perhaps making differences in the way men and women perceive sex, but culture certainly has played a very heavy role in altering our perceptions of this behavior. So here's the study. Imagine this. If you are a male, imagine an attractive female walks up to you. If you are a female listening to this, imagine an attractive male, someone you believe is very attractive by whatever your standards are. And that stranger walks up to you and says one of three things. Would you go on a date with me? Would you go to my apartment with me? Would you go to bed with me? All right, so different levels of intimacy. So stranger comes up to you and asks these questions. So we did this with males and females, and I want to show you the results that sort of speak to how culture and biology are colliding. Now let's be clear, men and women both enjoy sex, and we'll come back to that topic in a second. But our perceptions of sex, especially with strangers, is quite different. When we asked men, would you go on a date? So an attractive woman asked this stranger, would you go on a date? About 45% said yes. Of the men who had an attractive stranger come up to him and she asked, would you go to my apartment? About 70% said yes. And for the man who had an attractive woman walked up to them and said, would you go to bed with me? 75%. Now let's flip it. Let's do it the other way. Women listening, imagine an attractive male, by whatever standard you believe that is, comes up to you and says, would you go on a date with me? About 50%, so more women than men, said yes to that question. So women, an attractive man comes up to you and the first thing he says is, would you go to my apartment with me? Very few, less than 10% said yes to that question. And for the women who had an attractive stranger walk up to them and say, "Would you go to bed with me?" The answer was 0%. No women said yes to that question. Quite different than the 75. So, does that mean that men like sex more or want sex more? The data doesn't seem to support that. Instead, we have to look for the cultural or social context of these questions. For example, many men who said no, there were quite a few men who said no to all of these questions. The most common reason for men to say no was that they are already in an existing relationship. But for women who said no to any of these questions, the most common theme was, "I don't know you. What's wrong with you?" Well, think about that perceptual difference. Doesn't that kind of sound like the world today? I mean, the sad truth is, as a patriarchal society, and perhaps even just as a sex difference between men and women are much more likely to be sexually assaulted. They're much more likely to be attacked by a stranger than a male. So with that social climate already existing, that fear already existing, it kind of makes sense that men and women would start to show some different sexual trends. Yes, we see other differences. For example, when we ask men and women to report how many times a day they've had a sexual fantasy, slightly more men than women report having those fantasies. And if we look at self-stimulation or masturbation as one example, men typically masturbate more than women. However, it doesn't mean the number of men in the world masturbate more than the number of women in the world. Those numbers are actually fairly close. But at the same time, we can see differences in women. When we ask men and women, have you ever considered or engaged in a same-sex sexual activity, even though you currently now classify yourself as heterosexual, attracted to the opposite sex, women were much more likely to report some experimentation in their early adolescence or early adulthood. So showing a little bit more openness to exploration or fluidity there. But coming back to our point, to sort of the moral of the story is, even though we see these slight differences in patterns and in behavior, I do not want you to walk away thinking that, oh, men just like sex more. That's absolutely untrue. In fact, it doesn't make biological sense if one species liked it more than the others, because that would make reproduction much more difficult. Both men and women enjoy sex, but what we find is the variables that lead up to their enjoyment can be quite different. For example, when we ask men and women to watch pornography, we find that men are much more likely to like the experience of watching pornography. That's videos of people having sex. However, if you know anything about the industry of pornography, you might know that it is very male-dominated. It's definitely skewed, the majority is skewed towards that perspective. But, and this is where I find the story kind of interesting, when we find that women, and there are a minority of them who produce and create pornography, when we have their specific brand of adult films and we show them to women, we find about the same amount of women enjoy them, like far more than in the previous example. So in this case, it wasn't that women and men, like men are just going to like pornography more by default by some gender bias. Instead, we found that it was the production, it was the attitude, it was the focus, it was sort of the intent of the film. So men and women seem to be capable of enjoying sex, to being visually stimulated, being physically stimulated, obviously. So while there are differences, the question still remains how much of those differences are biological, but how much of those are because of the culture that we're a part of today. Now, lastly, I want to talk about sexual orientation, that sort of focus of our attention, our attraction, our desire. For many of us, when we think of sexual orientation, we think of the buzzwords of classification. We think of heterosexual, homosexual, bisexual, and those are fine. But they're a bit misleading because they imply, as many of us seem to feel, that there's 2 or possibly 3 very specific types of sexual orientation. And in fact, that doesn't seem to be the case. Most researchers in sort of sex and psychology seem to find the same conclusions, that sexuality seems to be on a spectrum. For example, most of us are going to fall towards the straight or heterosexual norm based on the percentage populations, meaning that the majority of us will identify as being attracted to the opposite sex. There will be a percentage of individuals who will report being attracted to the same sex. But if someone identifies as bisexual, we often imply that that means, oh, you like both men and women equally. That's completely untrue. In fact, the majority of individuals who report having an attraction to both sexes tend to still report favoritism. For example, someone may say, I prefer my same sex, but there are a few instances of individuals that were the opposite sex that I was attracted to. And the same for the other side. Most of the people you are attracted to will be the opposite sex, but there have been a few occasions where you were attracted to specific individuals that were the same sex. And so we kind of move on this scale for many of us, and certainly by the time we've passed through the later parts of puberty and reached adulthood, we've pretty much found where on that continuum we are. But we are reminded that in those early pubescent experiences, that may shift somewhat, as I mentioned earlier. Now, let's classify on the sort of the sexual minority, those who identify as either homosexual or bisexual, meaning they're attracted to the same sex. This is not a phenomenon that exists simply in humans. Thousands of species, including 450 species of mammals, seem to demonstrate same-sex pair bonding, meaning that in the physical activities, the bonding activities, even the sexual activities, they pair up with their same sex, much in the way we're talking about here. In terms of humans, to give you an exact percentage, it's very difficult. We know that throughout all of human civilization, there have been sexual minorities. However, what the percentage is or has been is very difficult. This is in part because we're talking about something that some people are still very sensitive about. In fact, to the point where they can be so against or disgusted by the process or possibility that someone is attracted to the same sex, they're willing to hurt or kill those individuals. Well, if you live in that climate, it makes sense that you're a lot less motivated to report yourself as being part of the sexual minority. Some of our best estimates come through census data, through agencies like the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, and currently their estimates are about 4%, so it sort of moves in that 4 to 5%. So yes, the vast majority of us, about 95-ish%, identify with heterosexual. About a 4% of the population, which still, that includes millions upon millions of men and women, are part of that sexual minority. Now, in terms of why would someone be attracted to the same sex, I have to say that's a good question, because we can't even answer why someone would be attracted to the opposite sex. Meaning, while we may conceptually understand that idea, such as with reproduction, we don't actually know what causes sexual orientation. We don't know why at puberty certain switches seem to turn on, turn off, that focuses our sexual attention on someone. And why for most of us those switches seem to be oriented towards the opposite sex, but for others they're oriented towards the same sex. Now, as scientific research continues, and let's be clear, like with anything with sex, this is newer research because it's taboo, and certainly not only is sex taboo, the idea of studying same-sex attraction because of certain people's moral compunctions becomes even more difficult. But over the last few decades, we're becoming better at finding out what doesn't cause same-sex attraction. There's lots of myths that still pervade culture, but it's worth getting rid of some of those now. For example, there's a concern that if a child is raised by a same-sex couple, that child is more likely to be homosexual or bisexual. That's completely untrue, and no data to support that whatsoever. There used to be an old myth that if mothers were dominant or more masculine in their qualities, and if fathers were more effeminate or nurturing or maternal in their qualities, that would create someone who has a same-sex attraction. That's completely untrue. Even today, I still hear parents arguing about toys. Boys playing with a Barbie, and that's going to somehow affect their sexuality. It's completely untrue. Those things do not seem to affect the development of same-sex or even opposite-sex attraction. So we're still exploring this mystery. And so I just ask that as you study this subject and maybe even write about this topic, something that you try to ask yourself. And in fact, here's 4 questions or 4 points you really should consider. First of all, like with obesity, be very careful when we talk about the one cause. Here's the thing that makes you straight or gay, for example. That's probably untrue. Most psychologists and biologists agree it's probably multiple variables that are putting us towards this course. Secondly, realize that whenever you talk about a minority of any kind, a racial minority, a sexual minority, a religious minority, a political minority, you need to be very careful that you don't assume that everyone in that group is the same because they're not you. This becomes especially a problem when we talk about same-sex attraction. For most of us who are heterosexual, because that is the majority, sexuality is really a descriptor. If you ask me to define myself, I would define myself by my job. I'll talk about the things I love to do, maybe how I dress, maybe my friends, my family, my relationships, certainly. But whenever we talk about same-sex attraction, we usually say, well, they're a gay person, as if that's their identity, that's number one on the list. And when we start doing that, we start to assume that everyone in a minority is all exactly the same. They all talk the same way and dress the same way and walk the same way, and those are the variables we should focus on. That's not true, okay? Third, be aware that anytime we do research on minorities, such as the sexual minority, we might not have good data because the better research has big sample sizes. Well, if you're studying something that's not only taboo, but as I mentioned, has a lot of baggage morally, politically, culturally, that we might be a lot less likely to get men and women who represent what would be a norm within that group. And finally, we need to realize that any explanations we have to explain why same-sex attraction happens must also explain why opposite sex attract, right? It can't just be, well, this causes someone to be gay. Well, what causes us to be not that? What switches in our brain? What chemicals, what environmental condition responses happen to put any of us on the track? Because for most of us, whatever sexual orientation you are that's listening to this video, realize that we all went through the very similar experiences, right? We started puberty, suddenly our attention shifted to someone, we started experiencing these feelings. It almost seemed like overnight. It wasn't a decision that we made. It was almost we went home for the summer or for a couple of weeks and we came back to school and suddenly people looked different and suddenly we were more interested in certain people than others. Well, something happened. Some things probably happened, and that's all we can really say is, most experts believe that it's probably this smorgasbord of biological predisposition and then some sort of environmental agents that also activate our focus and our attention, maybe even some levels of socialization. I don't know. We don't know. As I said, this is a sort of a bold new frontier of research in human biology and psychology, and this is in part because, frankly, we just weren't allowed to study things like this for the longest time and can still be quite difficult today. I'll leave you with one last thing on sex and sexuality, and that is if you are living as a sexual minority, you might wonder, are there any psychological ramifications to being gay or for children to be raised by same-sex parents? And the short version is no. People who like the same sex are just as happy, just as psychologically well-adjusted as those who like the opposite sex. Same for children. Children who are raised by same-sex couples have no more mental health or problems, no more achievement problems, self-esteem problems, whatever. The only differences we tend to find in these examples were if the men, women, or children are in regions of the world, regions of their own country that are against this lifestyle, that can create a dangerous or fearful climate for that family, then that could affect them. But in this case, that's a problem with the outside forces being violent, not a problem with the individuals themselves. And that's why the American Psychological Association, the American Psychiatric Association, even the American Academy of Pediatrics typically falls down on the side of supporting same-sex adoption, because ultimately it's about having loving parents to help a child grow and adjust. I know it's still kind of a hot issue, controversial issue. Anytime you talk about the sexual minority, I understand culturally, religiously, politically, where some of those beliefs come from. I can only give you the data, and the data is clear. Men and women who are gay, who are bisexual, who are heterosexual, we all have the same chances for happiness if the climate facilitates that. All right, we'll stop there. When we come back, we'll talk about motivation in everyday life and move towards the end of this chapter. See you then.